With Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse coming out, a wave of theories emerged wondering if one of the main characters, Gwen Stacy, is trans. My observations lead me to believe that Gwen is in fact not trans. But before I can explain my conclusions, I need to explain to you what semiotic in cinema is. Semiotic is the study of signs. Human culture is made up of signs, each of which stands for something other than itself, and the people inhabiting culture busy themselves making sense of those signs. A sign basically is a representation, often visual, of something that it is not. This is Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist who theorized semiotic at the dawn of the 20th century. Saussure describes semiotic as the association of the signifier, which is often an acoustic image, and the signified, defined as a content or a concept, which does not necessarily refer to something out there in the world. This is a lot of academic gibberish, just to say basically that a sign and what it represents are two different things. A skull, for example, represents death, despite death not having any physical form. Signs can be separated into three categories. Icons, which are signs that resemble what they represent. Indexes, which are signs that are related to what their meaning is. For example, the sound of thunder is an index for a storm. And lastly, the symbol, which is a sign, which is a social convention that has to be learned. Language is a good example of a symbolic sign. The word fire, for example, is a symbol of fire, despite not sharing any acoustical similarities with the actual fire. To use examples from Across the Spider-Verse, this picture that Gwen keeps in her drum set is an iconic sign. It's the simplest sign of them all. It directly resembles what it represents. This picture is just the sign that Gwen misses Miles. Iconic signs in movies are the simplest way of communicating an idea visually. An example of an indexical sign would be when Miles glitches at the end of the movie. The meaning is that he isn't in the correct dimension, and the glitch is a direct effect of that. Therefore, it is an index. An indexical sign. Indexical signs are a very effective way of communicating ideas without having to completely spell it out to the audience, making it deeper and more intellectual. Lastly, there's the symbolic sign, and that's where we get into the interesting part. Across the Spider-Verse is filled with symbols of pop culture, LGBTQ communities, and even from itself. Gwen's introduction in this movie is a symbol of the character's introductions from the first movie, and that's where it gets brilliant. Since the audience knows about these introductions and therefore has an expectation for this new one, the filmmakers can subvert said expectations to create a deeper meaning. For example, whereas most characters' introduction in the first movie focused around the idea of the "I'm the one and only Spider-Man,"
I've been the one and only Spider-Man.
Gwen's introduction of Miles focuses on the idea that he's not the only one.
And he's not the only one.
Just like this, the thematic differences between the first and second movie are established. Being highly dependent on culture, symbolic signs are really hard to use in film. They can add so much depth. And once again, for the sake of the video, let me just re-emphasize that message and meaning are two different things. Okay, for now, this all sounds just like a bunch of mental masturbation for the sake of making us filmmakers look smarter than we really are. Well, trust me, if you're ever gonna read about film theory, it's gonna get way worse. So basically what I'm saying is that signs can pretty much be everything and represent anything. And that the interpretation of said signs can vary depending on the culture of the viewer. Now that all of this is established, let's see what signs of trans identity we can find in Across the Spider-Verse. The first noticeable symbolic sign is the very obvious trans flag color palette that appears in Gwen's dimensions. And although it could be argued that this is just a stylistic choice to fit with her costume, we know for a fact that the visuals of every single dimension depends greatly on the personality of their respective spider-person. Hobie Brown, aka Spider-Punk, for example, has a continuously changing art style simply because he doesn't believe in consistency. Not only the colors, but also the settings in Gwen's dimensions are in perpetual motion. kind of like paint sweating on a canvas. Now, this might be a bit of a reach because I haven't seen anyone else talk about that. But motion is kinda an indexical sign for change, or in this case, transition. Additionally, most of the time Gwen's dimension has a lot of contrast in its colors, with the blues and the pinks being nearly complementary colors. And this high contrast in the colors is an iconical sign of internal conflict. And when analyzed under the lens of trans symbols, it could be said that this contrast is specifically a sign of conflicting identities. Now, this high contrast in Gwen's dimension is always present, until she finally makes peace with her dad, at which point the dominant color becomes white, which is a color in the trans flag which represents the concept of transition, showing that both Gwen and her dad understand that perhaps Gwen's identity doesn't really need to be labeled as long as she tries her best and does what she thinks is right. Talking about Gwen and her dad, this scene when Gwen reveals her identity to her dad is obviously a symbolical coming out moment. And I find it very interesting at some point when she takes off her mask, and you can see behind her there's still the pattern of the mask, showing that no matter how much she tries to be Gwen, she'll always be Spider-Woman, because that's her identity. Okay, now let's talk about body/gender, dysmorphia/dysphoria, whatever. Gender dysphoria is when there's a disconnect between someone's sense of identity and the gender they were assigned at birth. Body dysmorphia is an anxiety disorder that causes someone to have preoccupation about one aspect of how they look. Despite both those disorders being very different, they are still connected and often experienced by trans people. Now, a symptom shared by both those disorders is that the patient can find themselves unable to recognize themselves in a mirror. This is very applicable to Gwen, as throughout the movie it becomes a literal motif that she doesn't see herself in the mirrors. She sees her spider-sona. With all of this in mind, we can make even bigger assumptions. Although this is applicable to most superhero stories, it is arguable that the entire concept of the spider society is queer-coded, with the spider people transitioning from their birth identity through their spider-sona, being accepted by their peers as such whilst being rejected by their families, having to stay hidden, members of the spider society taking up non-gender traditional roles like Peter being the primary caretaker of Mayday or Spider-Bite being the tech person. It could be argued, with all that in mind, that the entire spider society is a metaphor to trans identity in this context. I mean, Miguel is literally a vampire, a mythical creature that has always been used as a queer symbol. But that's where I think the metaphor ends. The spider's sonas can simply not be a metaphor to trans identity because it would simply send a harmful message to the community. I mean, through transitioning into their spider sonas, the spider people have to give up on their families, sometimes on their values, and even on their sense of identity. This is a very unhealthy message to send to people that are actually already struggling with their identity. And I don't think that's what the movie is trying to do. As made very clear at the beginning of the video, the signifier and the signified are two very different things. Therefore, although the movie uses a plethora of trans signs and symbols to convey its message in a more effective and deeper way, I think that Gwen is neither trans nor a metaphor for trans identity. But despite all that, her story remains good trans representation. In my opinion, anyone can represent any group as long as their struggles are similar. And if, as a trans person, Gwen's story makes you feel heard and understood, then it's great.
Like, it makes kind of a difference whether Gwen Stacy is a boy who thinks he is a girl. That makes kind of a difference to the story, does it not?
But that's the thing, it literally makes no difference. Firstly, because it literally doesn't change anything to the story, and secondly, because Gwen is probably not trans, or if she is, there's nothing in the movie that really indicates it. Trans imagery and symbols are used to more effectively and realistically convey a story of change, transition, and identity. And the only difference it makes to the movie is that one, the story is conveyed in a more realistic and cool way, and two, trans people get representation without having to denature the original character. And even if it did denature the original character, it doesn't matter because she's from another dimension. Alright, this is the end of the video. Please consider leaving a like and a comment, and if you did like the video, please subscribe. Bye!